Hey everybody, Micah with Coronavirus Diaries, and today I just want to touch base briefly on bias, and namely confirmation bias and deconfirmation bias, as well as groupthink. The reason I decided I'm going to touch base on this is because I found myself firmly positioned in the middle of all of that stuff on Friday when I published a video titled Minnesotans Protest the Lockdown. I had basically heard helicopters overhead, people honking and cheering outside. I walked outside of my place, and a block away there's 1,000 people at the governor's mansion. At the time I was not aware exactly what was going on, but I wanted to go and document it, and in doing so I found myself caught up in a bit of I don't know, I guess it's groupthink. I'm hoping that one of my regular guests, Dr. Scarborough, psychologist and psychologist practicing, hopefully he can kind of dig in, and I'll use myself as a guinea pig. I don't mind doing that because it was real. Basically what had happened on Friday is I had done an interview with a healthcare worker who had discussed how there was roughly 250 healthcare workers that were being put on furlough from just one hospital, and I'd heard from somebody else at another hospital the same was happening. So we're talking many hundreds of healthcare workers furloughed, which is essentially being laid off with benefits, and they're being told currently that they will get their jobs back, but right now it's going to become without pay by having benefits. So that was a little concerning, considering that at the time the death rate for Minnesota was roughly 100, and it's just, I was struggling with this idea of like how the entire economy is being crushed, and yet they're laying off healthcare workers for a pandemic that's supposed to be overwhelming and horrible and all this, and to get back to that here in a minute. But and then also I had been in a discussion with a family member who, over a month ago had to close their business, and was then recently denied unemployment. Now it sounds like that might be changing. Something about the website in their state was really busted. A lot of people got denied, which is just crazy to think about as a state, the government failing their people in a time like this. But it sounds like they might be trying to rectify it, fix it. Time will tell. So to the point, I was going into that event, walking outside of my house, realizing there's 1,000 people in my neighborhood at the governor's mansion protesting to open up a lockdown. And yeah, I would say that I definitely had some sort of an emotional gravitation towards, yeah, it's about time we just start unlocking it slowly, was my thought process in certain categories, right? Like in the UK, in Italy, I believe they're talking about unlocking it for like 20 to 30-year-olds to be able to go back into the workforce and start making things happen. There's discussions around the antibodies. However, there's so much crazy information. That's one of the big things too with this bias. There's a confirmation bias and a deconfirmation bias, and I'm really hoping that regular guest, Dr. Scarborough, will be able to dig into this with me, a practicing psychologist, because it seems like when I had done this live stream, I had posted the video on this channel, but I also done a live stream with friends and family. Number one, I found out that there's people in my network that are polar opposites. There's people that are like, yes, it's time to get back to work, and there's other people that are like, basically, they took shots at me, It's interesting to see how fast people will attack somebody else, and how fast people will basically resort to name calling. Not even basically, it was resulting to name calling. And it just illustrates how polarized, everything is right now, with people don't really get into dialogue and have discussions anymore. It's just fighting and trying, it's even, you see it in what's going on with leaders currently, is that it's a lot of infighting. But with the confirmation biases, deconfirmation biases, you think about what's going on in your social media streams, whatever channels or platforms that is, you surround yourself, I surround myself predominantly, typically, with people that think alike, interact in the same activities, do the same things. And when you do that, you kind of end up pigeonholing yourself, if you're familiar with that term, in that the information that you're consuming regularly, the people you talk with regularly, are just there to basically bolster your own mindset and your own thought process. I want to go down a little trail of thought here, and it was based on my first year as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, and it was a communications course where we had to write a paper about something that we strongly supported, right? This was coming on the tail end of me doing private security in a high threat environment. For those of you that aren't familiar, private security is civilians carrying out security operations, you know, and you're being hired by government agencies. Without going into the politics of it, you know, I came back thinking I was being a patriot. I was serving my country. I was serving a bigger purpose and a mission. And ultimately what we were doing was doing explosive ordnance disposal of things that go boom in Iraq. So we were working with Corps of Engineers, and they were doing disposal of these munitions that were what would make the IEDs and such. I came back from that thinking really highly of the industry that I'd worked in, while at the same time there was a number of conflicts that were happening, one of which, many of those that you that may have followed what was going on with private sector security stuff, Blackwater, right? So private sector, they were involved, I believe it was called the Nisser Square Massacre. There was a number of people that were killed by these private security people, and there's a lot of controversy over really what happened there. There was, you know, shell casings from both AK-47s and their weapons. So there were people shooting at them. There was all sorts of stuff, but that's like way off topic. Back to the point, I came back from that deployment feeling like I needed to defend being a private security contractor. I went into it with the intention of being, you know, securing people, and I wrote this paper on private security. Well, then the second paper in this class, we had to basically attack everything that we had just written about. And it was a really, really good experiment in, you know, understanding arguments. And it was frustrating though, because I just spent a month building out this big paper on why private security contractors are essential for current environments in global conflict. But I wrote the second paper, and I did my best effort at digging up all the information that would refute anything that I had suggested. And I found a lot of interesting stuff. You know, I did a little bit of it when I wrote my paper, because it's something you need to do, is to understand the opposition, or the op. But I went much further with the second paper. Moving forward, the third paper, we took the information from both of those and then wrote a much more concise, deliberate, focused paper with much more informed, right? And it led me to a little bit of a different understanding that I had about the private sector, and it led me into different trains of thought, which I don't need to go into here, but that's kind of where what I think back to now is when, you know, I uploaded this video. There was a lot of people that seemed to go after it and attack it. You know, there's healthcare workers that are saying, hey, this is garbage, you shouldn't be doing this. Again, I wasn't really a part of it, but I did get caught up in it, and that goes back to the group think, and also having had that call with a family member that was struggling to just get unemployment, having been out of work for a month, burning through their savings. You know, and for people that don't have small business, there's a lot of overhead, especially if you have some sort of an establishment that you're renting. You're talking thousands of dollars a month, plus your mortgage, plus your car payment. So you can be doing really, really well in terms of financials, but as soon as, just imagine taking all of your income away. You have no significant other that's bringing in any income, and then on top of it, no unemployment. So that happened to somebody in my close circle, and it quite literally pissed me off. And so I'm sitting there, I was fuming about that. Since COVID started, I've been adamant about, yeah, it's something to consider, it's serious. As time goes on, it's getting more and more frustrating, because there's a lot more misinformation coming out. The CDC keeps bouncing back and forth on like wearing masks, don't wear masks, only wear cloth masks. It's, what is it? The testing. It's like, oh, there's all these tests going out. Now there's bad tests, there's bad information. The models that were being used a month ago are now being identified as total garbage because they were drastically using speculation and all sorts of stuff. It's just, I've got to the point where I gravitated towards a groupthink that happened really like on the spot. I walked out of my door frustrated with the call that I had gotten off of, contemplating why a bunch of healthcare workers are being laid off, or furloughed rather, not laid off, furloughed. And then I see this group of 1,000 people waving American flags. I didn't approach it as it was any sort of political rally. I approached it as a group of citizens that were saying, yo, it's time to start making changes with this lockdown. it really, really got to me. I uploaded the video anyway because I felt it was necessary to document, you know, in a timely manner that there was actually this big protest going on in my city, and not just in my city, blocks from my house. So I did it. In hindsight, I'm looking back and it's noticeable. I obviously knew I was a little bit emotional with it. And that's where this video is coming from, is I'm kind of trying to dissect that. In the future, being as I am supposed to be kind of presenting unbiased, you know, if I'm to be a media person of any sorts, whether, you know, and I've never really deemed myself a journalist. It's more about doing production. Most of the stuff that I've ever done has been related to topics or activities that I appreciate, you know, whether that's surfing or base jumping or whatever it is. I would make videos on this type of stuff. Now it's significantly different, and I'm realizing that I don't want to be somebody that's just pushing an agenda. Unfortunately, I think a lot of media, it's not about presenting facts and being level-headed about it. It's about pushing narratives and agendas and trying to prove something. So moving forward, I'm definitely going to be a lot more cognizant of how I present stuff and what I'm presenting. So with that, I wanted to just share a few, concepts or ideas, right? So in terms of what we know now, it's becoming very, very evident that there's a lot of uncertainty, like tons and tons. There's stuff coming out now that's suggesting over 2/3 of the people that are dying would have died regardless of COVID, just because they have multiple health complications. They're on a they're hanging on by a wire already. Unfortunate, but it's a case, it's life. This is just what's going to happen to all of us eventually. The other thing that they're finding is that as far as testing, there's been a lot, even with the CDC, there's confusion over testing and unsanitary practices and all this stuff. So that's a little bit frustrating. And then on top of it all, there's the testing to find out who's infected, right? Or the antibody test, they're proving to be a little more difficult to utilize that information than they were hoping. But just in terms of the data, so I think they had done, the proverbial they, had done a wide testing on a prison of some sort, or I think it was a prison, it might have been a nursing home, big difference, but a group of people, they found that a large percentage of them had already had or have it with limited to no symptoms at all. And there's talk about how if these percentages hold true, the number, you know, they've been talking 3 to 5% fatality or mortality, which was the models that were being used like a month and a half ago, that really pumped up the fear factor, I guess you would say, of lockdowns, like how important it is. The stuff they're suggesting now, one of the recent ones I'd seen, it was like 0.17% fatality rate. So that's, I mean, it's less than 1%, right? And this kind of leads itself into, and you know, maybe we talk about this with Dr. Scarborough, because it is psychology, but the trolley experiment. I kind of talked about the wildfires, or I did talk about the wildfires last week, and this notion of how COVID is kind of like a wildfire, but this is like a trolley experiment in a little bit of in a way. So the greater good, right? Do you crush an economy to try to save as many lives as you can, but at the same time create irreversible or potentially irreversible issues with an economy, creating a widespread issues throughout the social infrastructure, if you will? Or do you do a little bit limited, a much more limited type of a lockdown, you know, and social, you know, shelter in place type of scenario, while taking on more fatalities? And that's an ethical and a moral discussion. I'd love to have it with some people. If anybody ever reaches out, I'm all about having dialogue, right? Having a discussion and just seeing where it goes. But I think that's really what's happening right now in the nation, is that we're all part of the trolley experiment. And if you're not familiar with it, you should check it out. At a high level, it's essentially, if you were the one in control of a switch, there's a train coming, you see that the train is going to hit a person on that track. or it's gonna hit a group of people on that track unless you hit the switch. But if you hit the switch, there is a person on the other track that it'll hit. So the ethical or moral question is, do you make the decision to save more people while at the same time you're still going to eliminate somebody, kind of playing the God, but in some capacity, that's what's happening right now. Is as a society, as a culture, we have to make a decision on how tightly we hold the economy in a death choke, in a choke grip, or how much we try to defend those at highest risk. And I don't have the answer for that. I believe personally there needs to be some form of the immediate testing. You know, it sounds like that's going to likely be the fastest way back. I like the idea of letting the younger generation, if they want to, go back to work. I like the idea of letting those that are even in different demographics, say 30s and 40s, go back to work if they feel like it's, you know, if they're willing to take the risk. If those people that are at higher risk don't want to, you know, do something for them in some capacity, but then that leads its way into the concern of, you know, if we're pumping a bunch of money into the economy, then there's inflation and the potential of hyperinflation. There's no one right answer, and there's no one right path forward, and it's shrouded by so much speculation and uncertainty that what I'm seeing is, more than anything, it's simply creating toxic arguments. And it's not even so much dialogue anymore as it's just people picking sides, starting fights, calling people names, and it's unfortunate. So I don't know if anybody saw this, has any of their own thoughts, is open to even discussing anything as opposed to just taking shots. Cool, I'm about it. Let's get on let's do a live stream or something. I don't know. I'm down for whatever, but I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing. A lot of what I do, you know, it's trying to generate some sort of conversation, because that's the real way to kind of generate you know, a higher level of groupthink, as opposed to kind of what happened to me, I think, is that I got surrounded by a bunch of American flags, which I love America, I love my country. Hadn't really intended on participating in a very specific, in any type of a political rally of any sorts. I didn't even know that's what it was until after the fact. It apparently was some sort of gun rights activists that were supported by Trump. But yeah, I at any rate, it was more, for me, it was more about seeing a large group of people that were adamant about the freedom of speech, freedom of protest, and you know, trying to get something happening. The idea of being on a lockdown for another 6 months is intense. It's a pretty crazy thought. I can't imagine it would be that, but who knows? The little information we're getting out of China is that, you know, when they're opening up these cities again, then there's these hot spots that keep popping up. So I think we can anticipate that here. To what extent, I'm not sure, but I don't know. Food for thought. If you had to pick a number in order to get our economy back in the right direction to where it's not tanking, what would that number be? Out of 330 million people, what percentage is okay? I mean, it's easy to say nobody, but I think we all know that's not a realistic answer at all. Kind of like this. So they would talk about leaders in the military going into a war, and there's going to be a percentage of people that don't come back. It's a tough thing to stomach, but it's also a necessity. It's, you know, you can't have it both ways. So doing your mission and doing it to the best of your ability is all you can do, and even by doing that, you can still take losses, and we're going to take losses here just like every other country. So I don't know. Let me know. Let me hear your thoughts. Be interested to know. But until next time, Mike with Coronavirus Diaries. You guys stay safe out there and take it easy. Later.